So the drumbeat of war is growing louder. The question is where that march will lead. Well, for that, let's turn to investigative journalist and historian Gareth Porter, who is with us in our studios here. Gareth, thank you. Before we sort of get into the nuances in the U.S. administration's policy towards the issue, try to help me sort of dig through the rhetoric here, because everyone, each side, Israel, the Iranians, the Americans, are sort of playing this game of bluffing, of talking tough.
There is a lot of that going on, no question about it. I mean, the Iranian move to threaten to cut off exports of crude oil to European countries, not the first time they've done it, and of course it's the logical thing for them to do, because it is a bargaining tool for them to try to get Greece, Spain, and Italy, particularly, the three major European countries which do import large amounts of oil from Iran, to pull back and say, well, maybe we can figure out a way to avoid a cutoff of an ending of our dealings with Iran.
Those countries are struggling economically.
They're struggling economically, and this gives Iran an obvious bargaining chip, which the Iranians are the ones who are going to always play their bargaining chips. They are the world's greatest bargainers. It's not for nothing that we talk about Persian rugs. They're the original Persian rug salesman. And they always want to hold off or hold on to the bargaining chips until they can play them when the timing is right. And I think they now feel this is the time to do it.
So then what accounts, for example, for Israel's rhetoric? Clearly, the Israelis have geopolitical, strategic interest for not seeing a nuclear-armed Iran, but it does seem like the talk has been amped up massively in the past few months.
Well, there are two different levels of this. At one level, there's no doubt the Israelis, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, are playing the threat of a war against Iran for everything it's worth, to try to put pressure on Iran, to put pressure on the United States, perhaps even more than Iran, to do something more drastic, more fundamental against Iran. Of course, what they really want is for the United States to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. But behind that, there's a very serious question as to whether Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has himself personally a kind of Masada complex, as some Jewish friends call it, or a messianic complex about being the savior of the Jewish people, and thus being willing to risk really the end of the state of Israel. So there's a serious question about that. And I don't know the answer, but it does, in fact, demand very careful attention to his role in this.
But yet the timeline of all this came from the U.S. It was Panetta who leaked or sort of said that he's expecting the Israelis may attack.
Yeah, and I viewed that as another ploy, another bargaining tactic, if you will, to try to put pressure on Iran, to say, look, it's a good cop, bad cop routine. At the same time, I do think that the Obama administration is very concerned about the Israeli policy, that they want to distance the United States from any threat of war by Israel against Iran. And should the Israelis make that decision, it's not clear what Obama would do, whether he would come to Israel's assistance or not. He's been making very quiet, very subtle signals to both Israel and Iran that the United States would stay out of a war if the United States bases and forces were not attacked. But let me just step back for a moment and bring to bear a little bit of historical perspective. In this situation where everyone is very excited, U.S. news media sort of hyperventilating over every new charge against Iran and every new statement that Iran makes about its nuclear program, it's wise, I think, to just remember only a few years ago, 2006, when the Iranians were actually talking to the European three, the UK, Germany, and France, sitting down to negotiate. The Iranians were actually offering to limit the number of centrifuges to 3,000 or less. That is a deal that if the United States and the Europeans would have leapt at it, would have avoided this kind of crisis. At that point, the United States was not willing to support the deal, and it was not willing to give that element that the Iranians demanded, which was a security guarantee. The Europeans wanted it, the Bush administration refused. And how can you have any serious talks with Iran without really talking about a security guarantee? That is of the essence of the deal that has to be made.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, you talked about sort of the rhetoric coming out of the mainstream media and even from our own politicians, and the assumption is, or the portrayal of the Iranians is always as these, you know, irrational actors, this terrifying threat, and yet we haven't really seen, at least not in recent history, the Iranians acting out irrationally.
No, I mean, that, of course, is a complete caricature, and hardly even a caricature worth paying any attention to, because the matter of fact is that the Iranians are very careful calculators. They're very clever negotiators. They carefully consider the balance of forces and what their assets are and what the adversary's assets are. I think they are the exact opposite of the caricature that we're hearing, from, particularly, of course, from the Israelis, but also from the United States to a great extent.
And yet the Israelis, for instance, the Israelis have attacked unprovoked. We saw the bombings a few years ago. The Israelis, of course, have not admitted to having the nuclear program, but have also not signed on to any sort of international agreements.
Well, as a student of international politics, I have to point out that the contrast between Israel and Iran militarily is really quite profound. The Israelis have very great offensive capabilities. The Iranians have nothing. They have no offensive capabilities at all. All they have is the ability to retaliate, both through assets in other countries, their allies, Shia in particular allies in the Middle East, and through, you know, retaliation through missiles against Israel and against U.S. bases in the region. So really they are a defensive power by definition, by the very nature of their military assets and the lack of assets.
So in that light, since you say in your piece you sort of talked about the U.S. seems to be hinting that it would only get pulled into a conflict if its own soldiers or its own ships or its own bases were attacked, could we see perhaps, since there's so much brinkmanship here, an attack that was done perhaps by somebody else in order to pull the U.S. into that conflict?
Well, that of course is always a danger, that there could be a false flag attack or an effort at least at a false flag attack. But I can tell you that both the Iranians and the Americans are going to be very, very alert for anything of the sort. And it would have to be done very, very well in order to pass the test of scrutiny by both countries.
Right. And very briefly, I mean, we've seen everyone sort of throwing around this drumbeat to war, myself included. What would be the consequences, even of a quick U.S. military intervention attack in Iran? I mean, it seems like there'd be
Well, it's not going to be from the United States. I mean, I can guarantee you with almost certainty that the United States is not going to take the initiative to attack Iran. The question is, what would happen if Israel attacked? And what I'm hearing is that the U.S. military is very determined that the U.S. response immediately should be to call for a ceasefire, not to intervene, not to start their own war against Iran, but to call for a ceasefire. I think that's quite credible.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but quite interesting discussion, especially in light of all of this, again, amped up rhetoric wherever you turn. So thank you very much for shedding some balanced light on this issue. And that was Gareth Porter, investigative journalist and historian.